What's up, y'all? I'm at my house, so be prepared to see cats and dogs and whatnot. We are going to read chapter one of The Great Gatsby. Yesterday, we introduced the characters and we talked a little bit about Nick, okay? Nick is our narrator. He is not omniscient, and he is also unreliable. And when we talked about that, unreliable means that we are solely seeing the story through Nick's perspective. So when other characters are analyzed, when he talks about other characters, we are seeing that based off of Nick's perspective. So just want to make sure everybody is understanding that. He's unreliable because he obscures the truth and he sees what he wants to see. So something I want you to think about while we're reading is, what is Nick's role in the story? Okay. Also, this story is a bit out of order, so we will kind of jump back and forth. So I want you to remember that as well, okay? In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in the world haven't had the advantages that you've had. All right, so right away we see that this is a bit thoughtful, but it's also a bit privileged. He is a bit snobby, but he's trying to make himself a bit more reliable. We'll see if it works. He didn't say any more, but we've always been unusually communicative in a reserved way, and I understood that he meant a great deal more than that. In consequence, I'm inclined to reserve all judgments, a habit that has opened up many curious natures to me, and also made me the victim of not a few veteran bores. The abnormal mind is quick to detect and attach itself to this quality when it appears in a normal person. And so it came about that in college, I was unjustly accused of being a politician. Okay, so he says he reserves all judgment, but I think you'll soon see that he really doesn't. Because I was privy to the secret griefs of wild, unknown men. Most of the confidences were unsought. Frequently, I have feigned sleep, preoccupation, or a hostile levity when I realized by some unmistakable sign that an intimate revelation was quivering on the horizon. For the intimate revelation of young men, or at least in terms in which they express themselves, are usually plagiaristic and marred by obvious suppressions. Reserving judgment is a matter of infinite hope. I am still a little afraid of missing something if I forget that, as my father snobbishly suggested, and I snobbishly repeat, a sense of fundamental decencies is parceled by unequally at birth. Okay, so people are not equal. He also says he reserves judgment, but he really doesn't. And after boasting this way in my tolerance, I came out to the admission that it has a limit. Conduct may be founded on the hard rock or the wet marshes, but after a certain point, I don't care what it's founded on. When I came back from the East last autumn, I felt that I wanted the world to be in uniform, and as a sore moral attention forever. I wanted no more riotous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. Only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction. Okay, so Gatsby is the only one that he is not judging. So we know something happened. So he came back from the East last autumn. Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have an unaffected scorn. If personality is an unknown series of successful gestures, then there was something gorgeous about him. Okay, pay attention to how he describes Gatsby. Some heightened sensitivity to the promises of life, as if he were related to one of those intricate machines that register earthquakes 10,000 miles away. This responsiveness had nothing to do with that flabby impressionability which is dignified under the name of creative temperament. It was an extraordinary gift for hope, a romantic readiness such as I have never found in any other person, and which it is not likely I shall ever find again. No, Gatsby turned out all right in the end. It was that what preyed on Gatsby What foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and the short-winded elations of men? Okay, so he is foreshadowing something here. All right, so he doesn't hold judgment against Gatsby because Gatsby was preyed upon. Okay, so I want you to think about, how does Nick feel about Gatsby? Okay, Nick is an unreliable narrator. Can we trust what he is saying? Also remember that he described Gatsby as being gorgeous. My family had been prominent, well-to-do people in this middle western city for 3 generations. So he comes from money, he comes from privilege. The Carraways are something of a clan, and we have a tradition that we're descended from the Dukes of Buccleuch. But the actual founder of my line was my grandfather's brother, who came here in 51, sent a substitute to the Civil War, and started the wholesale hardware business that my father carries on today. I never saw this great uncle, but I'm supposed to look like him, with special reference to the rather hard-boiled paintings that hang in my father's office. I graduated from New Haven in 1915, just a quarter of a century after my father, and a little later I participated in the delayed tectonic migration known as the Great War. Okay, you know from your history classes that the Great War was World War I. I enjoyed the counter raid so thoroughly that I came back restless. Instead of being the warm center of the world, the Middle West now seemed like the ragged edge of the universe. He wanted more. He wanted more action than what the Midwest could give him. So I decided to go east and learn the bond business. Everybody I knew was in the bond business, so I supposed it could support one more single man. All my aunts and all my uncles talked it over as if they were choosing a prep school for me, and finally said, "Why, yes," with every grave, hesitant face. Father agreed to finance me for a year, and after various delays, I came east permanently, I thought, in the spring of 22. Okay, so his parents are giving him enough money to where he can go east to New York to try to get into the bond business. The practical thing was to find rooms in the city, but it was a warm season and I had just left a country of wide lawns and friendly trees, so when a young man at the office suggested that we take a house together in a commuting town, it sounded like a great idea. He found the house, a weather-beaten cardboard bungalow, at $80 a month, but at the last minute the firm ordered him to Washington, and I went out to the country alone. I had a dog, at least I had him for a few days until he ran away, an old Dodge and a Finnish woman who made my bed and cooked breakfast and mustered Finnish wisdom to herself over the electric stove. All right, so he had a dog that he lost. He had an old woman from Finland who came in and cooked, and he had an old Dodge. So there you go. It was lonely for a day or so until one morning some man, more recently arrived than I, stopped me on the road. "How do you get to West Egg Village?" he asked helplessly. I told him, and as I walked on, I was lonely no longer. I was a guide, a pathfinder, an original settler. He had casually conferred on me the freedom of the neighborhood. And so with the sunshine and the great bursts of leaves growing on trees, just as things grow in fast movies, I had that familiar conviction that life was beginning over with the summer. There was so much to read, for one thing, and so much fine health to be pulled down out of the young breathing air. I bought a dozen volumes on banking and credit and investment securities, and they stood on my shelf in red and gold like new money from the mint, promising to unfold the shining secrets of only Midas and Morgan and Massness knew. And I had the high intention of reading many other books besides. I was rather literary in college. One year, I wrote a series of very solemn and obvious editorials for the Yale News. And now I was going to bring back all such things into my life and become again the most limited of all specialists and well-rounded men. This isn't just an epigram. Life is much more successful, looked at from the single window after all. Okay, so we're going to start getting into the setting. It was a matter of chance that I should have rented a house in one of the strangest communities in North America. It was that slender, riotous island which extends itself due east of New York, and where there are, among other natural curiosities, 2 unusual formations of land 20 miles from the city, a pair of enormous eggs. Okay, they're not really eggs, they look like eggs, okay? So this is what we're known as east and west egg. It's drawn on the back of the wall, okay? So let's kind of chat about this. Identical in contour and separated only by a courtesy bay, jut out in the most domesticated body of saltwater in the Western Hemisphere, the Great Wet Barnyard of Long Island Sound. Okay, so what separates these two pieces of land that look like eggs is a body of water. They are not perfect ovals like the egg in the Columbus story. They are both crushed flat at the contact end. But their physical resemblance must be a source of perpetual confusion to the gulls that fly overhead. To the wingless, a more arresting phenomenon is their dissimilarity in every particular excerpt, shape, and size. All right, so here we go. I lived in West Egg. This is where the new rich live, not the old money, the new money. Well, the less fashionable of the two. This is the most superficial tag to express the bizarre and not the little sinister contrast between them. My house was at the very tip of the egg, only 50 yards from the Sound, and squeezed between two huge places that rented for $12,000 or $15,000 a season. The one on my right was a colossal affair by any standard. It was a factual imitation of some Hotel de Ville in Normandy, with a tower on one side spanking new under a thin beard of raw ivy, and a marble swimming pool, and more than 40 acres of lawn and garden. It was Gatsby's mansion. Or rather, as I didn't know Mr. Gatsby, it was a mansion, inhabited by a gentleman of that name. My own house was an eyesore, but it was a little eyesore, and it had been overlooked. So I had a view of the water, a partial view of my neighbor's lawn, and the consoling proximity of millionaires, all for $80 a month. Okay, so Nick kind of lives in like a shack, what would be kind of like a shed in between two mansions. And he's like, hey, it's not that bad because I have access to the Sound, which is the ocean, and I have access to millionaires, and the lawns are beautiful, so I'm doing all right. Across the Courtesy Bay, the white palaces of fashionable East Egg. Okay, this is the old money. This is where Tom and Daisy Buchanan live. Glittered along the water, and the history of the summer really begins on the evening I drove over there to have dinner with the Tom Buchanans. Daisy was my second cousin once removed, and I'd known Tom in college. And just after the war, I spent 2 days with them in Chicago. Her husband, among various physical accomplishments, had been one of the most powerful ends that ever played football at New Haven. A national figure, in a way, one of those men who reached such an acute, limited excellence at 21 that everything afterward savors of anticlimax. His family were enormously wealthy. Even in college, his freedom with money was mattered for reproach. Okay, so he had unlimited amounts of money. All right, so he had accomplished so much by the age of 21. He was so athletic that anything after that seemed like the anticlimax. But he had left Chicago and come east in a fashion that rather took your breath away. For instance, he brought down a string of polo ponies from Lake Forest. It was hard to realize that a man in my own generation was wealthy enough to do that. Why they came east? I don't know. They had spent a year in France for no particular reason, and then drifted here and there unrestfully, wherever people played polo and were rich together. This was a permanent move, said Daisy over the telephone, but I didn't believe it. I had no sight into Daisy's heart, but I felt that Tom would drift on forever seeking a little wistfully for the dramatic turbulence of some irrevocable football game. And so it happened that on a warm, windy evening, I drove over to East Egg to see two old friends whom I scarcely knew at all. Their house was even more elaborate than I expected. A cheerful red and white Georgian colonial mansion overlooking the bay. The lawn started at the beach and ran toward the front door for a quarter of a mile, jumping over sundials and brick walks and burning gardens. Finally, when it reached the house, drifting up the side in bright vines, as though from the momentum of its run. The front was broken by a line of French windows, glowing now, with reflected gold and wide open to the warm, windy afternoon. And Tom Buchanan, in riding clothes, was standing with his legs apart on the front porch. Okay, so here's our description of Tom. Make sure you notate it's on page 7 because we're going to go back later and do something with this. He had changed since his New Haven years. Now he was a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30, with a rather hard mouth and a supercilious manner. 2 shining, arrogant eyes had established dominance over his face and gave him the appearance of always leaning aggressively forward. Not even the effeminate swank of his riding clothes could hide the enormous power of that body. He seemed to fill those glistening boots until he strained the top lacing, and you could see a great pack of muscle shifting when his shoulders moved under his thin coat. It was a body capable of enormous leverage, a cruel body. His speaking voice, a gruff, husky tenor, added to the impression of fractiousness he conveyed. There was a touch of paternal contempt in it, even toward people he liked. And there were men at New Haven who still hated his guts. Now, don't you think my opinion on these matters is final, he seemed to say, just because I'm stronger and more of a man than you are. We were in the same senior society, and while we were never intimate, I always had the impression that he approved of me and wanted me to like him with some harsh, defiant wistfulness of his own. Okay, so they were in the same fraternity, and while they weren't real close, while they weren't great friends, he always felt that Tom kind of liked him as a friend. Okay. We talked for a few minutes on the sunny porch. I've got a nice place here, he said, his eyes flashing and restless. Turning me around by one arm, he moved a broad, flat hand along the front vista, including in its sweep a sunken Italian garden, a half-acre of deep, pungent roses, and a snub-nosed motorboat that bumped the tide offshore. So he's got this huge garden. He's got a motorboat. What doesn't he have? It belonged to Demamine, the oil man. He turned me around again, politely and abruptly. We'll go inside. We walked through a high hallway into a bright, rosy-colored space, fragilely bound into the house by French windows at either end. The windows were ajar and gleaming, white against the fresh glass outside that seemed to grow a little way into the house. A breeze blew across the room, blew curtains in at one end and out the other, like a pale flag, twisting them up towards the frosted wedding cake of the ceiling, and then rippled over the wine-colored rug, making a shadow on it as wind does the sea. Do you want to say hi? You want to say hi, Lucifer? Come here. You want to say hi? No? Okay. The only completely stationary object in the room was an enormous couch on which 2 young women were buoyed up as though upon an anchored balloon. They were both in white, and their dresses were rippling and fluttering, as if they had just been blown back and after a short flight around the house. I must have stood for a few minutes listening to the whip and snap of the curtains and the groan of a picture on the wall. Then there was a boom as Tom Buchanan shut the rear window and caught wind died out of about the room, and the curtains and the rugs and the 2 young women ballooned slowly to the floor. Okay, so what's going on is it's summertime. Remember, guys, they don't really have AC then. So all the doors are open. There's doors on either side, like the French doors, and they're all open, and it's forcing the curtains to flow up and flutter around, and it just looks like everything is just floating, okay? Here we go with Jordan. The younger of the 2 was a stranger to me. She was extended full length at her end of the divan, completely motionless and with her chin raised a little as if she were balancing something on it, which was quite likely to fall. If she saw me out of the corner of her eyes, she gave no hint of it, indeed. I was almost surprised into the murmuring an apology for having disturbed her by coming in. Okay, so these girls are just kind of lying all over the couch. You know, it's the middle of the afternoon, it's hot, they're not paying any attention to Nick. The other girl, Daisy, made an attempt to rise. She leaned slightly forward with a conscientious expression. Then she laughed, an absurd, charming little laugh. And I laughed too, and came forward into the room. I'm paralyzed with happiness, she laughed again as if she said something very witty, and held my hand for a moment, looking up into my face, promising that there was no one in the world she so much wanted to see. That was a way she had. She hinted in a murmur that the surname of the bouncing girl was Baker. "I've heard it," said Daisy. Daisy's murmur was only to make people lean toward her, an irrelevant criticism that made it no less charming. At any rate, Miss Baker's lips fluttered. She nodded at me almost imperceptibly, and then quickly tipped her head back again. The object she was balancing had obviously tottered a little and given her something of a fright. Again, a sort of an apology rose to my lips. Almost an exhibition of complete self-sufficiency draws a stunned tribute from me. Okay, so he's like, wow, I'm kind of bothering these women. I'm kind of feeling awkward. I looked back at my cousin, who began to ask me some questions in her low, thrilling voice. It was the kind of voice that the ear follows up and down, as if each speech is an arrangement of the notes that will never be played again. Her face was sad and lovely and bright things in it, bright eyes and a bright, passionate mouth. But there was an excitement in her voice that men who had cared for her found difficult to forget. A singing compulsion, a whispered listen, a promise that she had done gay, exciting things just a while since, and that there were gay, exciting things hovering in the next hour. Okay, we mean fun by that, exciting. Okay, so he's hinting here that many men had loved Daisy. She has that way. I told her how I'd stopped off in Chicago for a day on the way east, and how a dozen people had sent their love through me. "Do they miss me?" she cried ecstatically. "The whole town is desolate. All cars have the left rear wheel painted black as a mourning wreath, and there's persistent wail all night along the North Shore." Okay, he's joking. "How gorgeous! Let's go back, Tom, tomorrow." Then she added irreverently, "You ought to see the baby." "I'd like to." "She's asleep. She's 3 years old. Haven't you ever seen her?" "Never." "Well, you ought to see her. She's—" Tom Buchanan, who had been hovering restlessly about the room, stopped and rested his hand on my shoulder. "What you doing, Nick?" "I'm a bond man." "With who?" I told him. "Never heard of them," he remarked decisively. This annoyed me. "You will," I answered shortly. "You will if you stay east." "Oh, I'll stay in the east. Don't you worry," he said, glancing at Daisy and then back at me as if he were alert for something more. "I'd be a goddamn fool to live anywhere else." At this point, Miss Baker said, "Absolutely," with such a suddenness that I started. It was the first word she had uttered since I came into the room. Evidently, it surprised her as much as it did me, for she yawned and with a series of rapid, deft movements stood up in the room. "I'm stiff," she complained. "I've been lying on the sofa for as long as I can remember." "Don't look at me," Daisy retorted. "I've been trying to get you to New York all afternoon." "No, thanks," said Miss Baker to the 4 cocktails just in from the pantry. "I'm absolutely in training." Okay, remember we learned yesterday that Jordan is a pro golfer. Her host looked at her incredulously. "You are?" He took down his drink as if it were a drop in the bottom of the glass. "How you ever get anything done is beyond me." I looked at Miss Baker, wondering what it was she got done. I enjoyed looking at her. She was slender, small-breasted girl with an erect carriage, which she accentuated by throwing her body backward at the shoulders like a young cadet. Her gray, sun-strained eyes looked back at me with polite, reciprocal curiosity out of a wan, charming, discontented face. It occurred to me now that I'd seen her or a picture of her somewhere before. Okay, so I want you to kind of pay attention to how Nick has described his relationships. Gatsby he described as being gorgeous. For Jordan Baker, she is described as looking like a little boy, like a cadet. She is thin and slender. So something I want you to think about. In the 1920s, Fitzgerald wrote this book, and the 1920s was a period of acceptance and experimentation, and scholars have said that Nick is perhaps gay. So I'm going to let you decide this. This is why we said yesterday that he was sort of dating Jordan. And one of the reasons that perhaps he does not judge Gatsby is because he is in love with Gatsby. Okay, let's go on. You live in West Egg, she remarked contemptuously. I know somebody there. I don't know a single. You must know Gatsby. All right, so this is our first reference so far. Gatsby? Demanded Daisy. What Gatsby? Before I could reply that he was my neighbor, dinner was announced. Wedging his tense arm imperatively under mine, Tom Buchanan compelled me from the room as though he were moving a checker to another square. Slenderly, languidly, their hands set lightly on their hips, the two young women preceded us out onto a rosy-colored porch, open toward the sunset where 4 candles flickered on the table in the diminished wind. Why candles? Objected Daisy, frowning. She snapped them out with her fingers. In 2 weeks, it'll be the longest day of the year. She looked at us radiantly. Do you always watch for the longest day of the year and then miss it? I always watch for the longest day of the year and then miss it. Okay, so Daisy doesn't exactly pretend to be smart. Okay, and this was kind of what was expected for women. Brains was not really valued. We ought to plan something, yawned Miss Baker, sitting down at the table as if she were getting into bed. All right, said Daisy. What shall we plan? She turned to me helplessly. What do people plan? Before I could answer, her eyes fastened on an odd expression on her little finger. Look, she complained. I heard it. We all looked. The knuckle was black and blue. You did it, Tom, she said accusingly. I know you didn't mean to, but you did do it. That's what I get for marrying a brute of a man. A great, big, hulking, physical specimen of a... I hate the word hulking, objected Tom crossly, even in kidding. Hulking, insisted Daisy. Sometimes she and Miss Baker talked to one another obtrusively, and with a bantering inconsequence that was never quite chatter, that was as cool as their white dresses and their impersonal eyes in the absence of all desire. They were here, and they accepted Tom and me, making only polite, pleasant effort to entertain or to be entertained. They knew that presently dinner would be over, a little later that evening too, would be over and casually put away. It was sharply different from the West, where an evening was hurried from phase to phase towards its close, in a continually disappointed anticipation, or else in sheer nervous dread of the moment itself. You make me feel so uncivilized, Daisy, I confessed on my second glass of corky, but rather impressive claret. Can't you talk about crops or something? I meant nothing in a particular by this remark, but it was taken up in an unexpected way. Civilization's going to pieces, broke out Tom violently. I've gotten this terrible pessimist about things. Have you read The Rise of the Colored Empires by this man Goddard? Okay, so remember I said that Nick was a white supremacist. Remember we looked at the Immigration Act of 1924. Okay, so all of this kind of goes into his character. Why, no, I answered, rather surprised by his tone. Well, it's a fine book, and everybody ought to read it. The idea is, if we don't look out, the white race will be utterly submerged. It's all scientific stuff. It's been proved. Tom's getting very profound, said Daisy with an expression of unthoughtful sadness. He reads deep books with long words. What was that word? Okay, again, is Daisy as dumb as she's playing, or is she really smart? Well, these books are all scientific, insisted Tom, glancing at her impatiently. This fellow was working out the whole thing. It's up to us, who are the dominant race, to watch out for these other races. We'll have control of things. We've got to beat them down, whispered Daisy, winking ferociously toward the fervent sun. You ought to live in California, began Miss Baker. But Tom interrupted her by shifting heavily in his chair. This idea is that we're Nordics. I am, and you are, and you are, and... After an infinitesimal hesitation, he included Daisy with a slight nod, and she winked at me. And we're produced all these things that go to make civilization. Oh, science and art and all that. Do you see? There was something pathetic in his concentration, as if his complacency, more acute than of old, was not enough to him any more. When almost immediately the telephone rang inside and the butler left the porch, Daisy seized upon the momentary interruption and leaned toward me. "I'll tell you a family secret," she whispered enthusiastically. "It's about the butler's nose. Do you want to hear about the butler's nose? That's why I came over tonight." Well, he wasn't always a butler. He used to be a silver polisher for some people in New York that had a silver service for 200 people. He had to polish it from morning till night until finally it began to affect his nose. "Things went from bad to worse," suggested Miss Baker. "Yes, things went from bad to worse until finally he had to give up his position." For a moment, the last sunshine fell with romantic affection upon her glowing face. Her voice compelled me forward breathlessly, and I listened when the glow faded each light, deserting her with a lingering regret, like children leaving a pleasant street at dusk. The butler came back and murmured something close to Tom's ear, whereupon Tom frowned, pushed back his chair, and without a word went inside. As if his absence quickened something within her, Daisy leaned forward again, her voice glowing and singing. "I love seeing you at my table, Nick. You remind me of a rose, an absolute rose. Doesn't he?" She turned to Miss Baker for confirmation. "An absolute rose." This was untrue. I was not even faintly like a rose. She was only extemporizing, but a stirring warmth flowed from her, as if her heart was trying to come out, to conceal it in one of those breathless, thrilling words. Then suddenly she threw her napkin on the table and excused herself and went to the house. Miss Baker and I exchanged a short glance, consciously devoid of meaning. I was about to speak when she at least said, "Shh," in a warning voice. A subdued and passionate murmur was audible in the room beyond, and Miss Baker leaned forward, unashamed, trying to hear. She murmured trembly on the verge of coherence, sank down, mounted excitedly, and then ceased together. "This Mr. Gatsby you spoke of is my neighbor," I said. "Don't talk. I want to hear what happens." "Is something happening?" I inquired innocently. "You mean you don't know?" said Miss Baker, honestly surprised. "I thought everyone knew." "I don't." "Why," she said hesitantly, "Tom's got some woman in New York." "Got some woman?" I repeated blankly. Miss Baker nodded. "She might have the decency not to telephone him at dinner time, don't you think?" Almost before I had grasped her meaning, there was a flutter of a dress and a crunch of leather boots, and Tom and Daisy were back at the table. "It couldn't be helped," cried Daisy with tense gaiety. She sat down, glanced searchingly at Miss Baker, and then at me, and continued, "I looked outdoors for a minute, and it's very romantic outdoors. There's a bird on the lawn, and I think might be a nightingale come over on the Cunard or white sea line. He's singing away." Her voice sang. "It's romantic, isn't it, Tom?" "Very romantic," he said, and then miserably to me, "If it's light enough for dinner, I want to take you down to the stables." The telephone rang inside, startlingly, and Daisy shook her head decisively at Tom. The subject of the stables, in fact, all subjects, vanished into thin air. Among the broken fragments of the last 5 minutes at table, I remember the candles being lit again, pointlessly, and I was conscious of wanting to look squarely at everyone and yet to avoid all eyes. I couldn't guess what Daisy and Tom were thinking, but I doubt if even Miss Baker, who seemed to have mastered a certain hearty skepticism, was able utterly to put his fifth guest shrill, metallic urgency out of mine. To a certain temperament, the situation might have seemed intriguing, but my own instinct was to telephone immediately for the police. The horses, needless to say, were not mentioned again. Tom and Miss Baker, with several feet of twilight between them, strolled back into the library as if to a vigil beside a perfectly tangible body, while trying to look pleasantly interested and a little deaf. I followed Daisy around a chain of connecting verandas to the porch in front. In a deep gloom, we sat down side by side on a wicker settee. Daisy took her face in her hands, as if feeling a lovely shape, and her eyes moved gradually onto a velvet dusk. I saw the turbulent emotions possessed her, So I asked what I thought would be some sedative question about her little girl. Okay, so we can see that Daisy is clearly bothered by this. She likes to act, she likes to put on a scene, but she's kind of showing a little bit of who she really is. We don't know each other very well, Nick, she said suddenly. Even if we are cousins, you didn't come to my wedding. I wasn't back from the war. That's true, she hesitated. Well, I've had a very bad time, Nick, and I'm pretty cynical of everything. Evidently, she had reason to be. I waited, but she didn't say any more, and after a moment I returned rather feebly to the subject of her daughter. I suppose she talks and eats and everything. Oh, yes, she looked at me absently. Listen, Nick, let me tell you what I said when she was born. Would you like to hear? Very much. I'll show you how I've gotten to feel about things. Well, she was less than an hour old, and Tom was God knows where. I woke up of the ether with an utterly abandoned feeling, and asked a nurse right away if it was a boy or girl. Okay, so remember, back then they used to kind of completely knock you out to have a baby, all right? She told me it was a girl, and so I turned my head away and wept. All right, I said. I'm glad it's a girl. And I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world, a tragic little fool. Okay, so this is probably one of the quotes that's quoted all the time in The Great Gatsby because it really kind of demonstrates who Daisy is. She's not a fool. She's not stupid. She is a product of her environment because during this time, society does not value intelligent women. The older generations valued submissive women. The younger generation valued silly, pleasure-seeking women. This quote implies that girls can only have fun. She is supposed to be beautiful and simplistic. Daisy often acts and conforms to what was expected of women in the 1920s. You see, I think everything's terrible anyhow, she went on in a convinced way. Everybody thinks so. The most advanced people. And I know. I've been everywhere and seen everything and done everything. Her eyes flashed around her in a defiant way, rather like Tom's eyes flashed around her in a defiant way, rather like Tom, and she laughed with a thrilling scorn. Sophisticated. God, I'm so sophisticated. The instant her voice broke off, ceasing to compel my attention, my belief, I felt the basic insincerity of what she had said. It made me uneasy, as though the whole evening had been a trick of some sort to exact a contributory emotion from me. I waited, and sure enough, in a moment she looked at me with an absolute smirk on her lovely face, as if she had asserted her membership in a rather distinguished secret society to which she and Tom belonged. Okay, so for a moment, we started to see who she really was, but then she continues to put on that face. She continues to need to act, and she quickly switched back to that silly 1920s girl. Okay, so we're going to end it here today. Tomorrow we will pick up. We're on page 17, where it begins inside.